Right now, at this very moment, something extraordinary is happening inside your skull. Billions of electrical impulses are racing through roughly 86 billion neurons, creating cascading waves of chemical signals that somehow, through some process that no scientist on Earth can fully explain, produce the experience of hearing these words. You feel the weight of your body against whatever surface supports you. You sense the temperature of the room. Perhaps you notice the quiet hum of an appliance, or the distant murmur of traffic, or the particular quality of silence that settles over a house when the day is done. Thoughts drift through your mind like clouds passing across an open sky. Memories surface and fade. Emotions color your awareness in ways too subtle to name. And all of this, every texture and tone of your experience emerges from what is, as far as physics can tell, a 3-pound lump of electrochemical jelly sitting in the dark inside your skull. But here is the question that has kept the brightest minds in human history awake at night. Why does any of this feel like anything at all? Why aren't you simply a biological machine processing information in the dark, with no inner experience, no felt sense of being alive? The answer to that question may be far stranger, far more beautiful, and far more ancient than you have ever imagined. Because what if consciousness doesn't begin in your brain? What if it doesn't begin anywhere at all? Because it was always here, woven into the very fabric of existence from the first instant of creation. Welcome back, dear friends. Before we begin tonight's journey, let me know where in the world you are listening from. Whether you are settling into bed in Tokyo or Sao Paulo, London or Lagos, there is something deeply beautiful about imagining these ideas traveling across the globe, finding their way into quiet rooms where restless minds are seeking peace. If you find comfort in these nighttime explorations of wisdom, I would be so grateful if you would subscribe and like this video to help these gentle conversations reach others who need them. Tonight, we are going to explore what may be the most radical and yet the most ancient idea in all of philosophy and science. The idea that the universe itself is conscious, that the cosmos is not a dead machine grinding through meaningless motion, but a living, breathing, aware entity of which you and I are intimate expressions. We will travel from the marble halls of ancient Athens to laboratories where physicists fire single electrons through impossible barriers. We will meet a priest whose books were banned by his own church, a philosopher who was burned alive for his beliefs, and a neuroscientist who claims he can measure the consciousness of a thermostat. By the time we reach the end of tonight's journey, I suspect you will never look at a stone, a star, or your own drifting thoughts in quite the same way again. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and allow this question to unfold at its own unhurried pace. After all, if the universe truly is alive, then the consciousness you bring to this moment is not separate from the cosmos, but an expression of it. And there may be no more fitting way to honor that connection than by listening quietly as the night deepens around you. To understand why some of the most serious thinkers alive today believe the universe might be conscious, we need to start with a problem. Not just any problem, but what the Australian philosopher David Chalmers called, in a now legendary 1995 paper, the hard problem of consciousness. And to grasp why this problem matters so much, consider a thought experiment. Imagine that scientists have finally mapped every neuron in the human brain. They know exactly which neurons fire when you taste chocolate, when you fall in love, when you see the color red. They can predict, with perfect accuracy, every behavior, every decision, every word you will ever say. They have solved every so-called easy problem of consciousness. They understand memory, attention, perception, language, motor control. They know how the brain processes information in exquisite mechanical detail. And yet, after all of this extraordinary achievement, one question remains completely untouched. Why does any of it feel like something? Why does the firing of certain neurons produce the rich, subjective, unmistakably real experience of tasting chocolate rather than simply processing chemical information in silence? Why does a particular wavelength of light create the vivid sensation of redness rather than just triggering an electrical response? This is the hard problem. It is not a problem about the mechanics of the brain. It is a problem about why there is an inner life at all, why the lights are on, why there is something it is like to be you. To feel the full force of this puzzle, consider what happens when you listen to music. Sound waves vibrate the tiny bones of your inner ear. These vibrations are converted into electrical signals that travel along the auditory nerve to your brain. Neurons in your auditory cortex fire in patterns that correspond to the frequencies, amplitudes, and timbres of the incoming sound. All of this is mechanical, measurable, and in principle entirely understandable in terms of physics and neuroscience. But none of it explains the experience of music. None of it accounts for the way a particular melody can make your chest ache with longing, or the way a sudden shift from minor to major key can flood you with unexpected hope. The neural correlate of hearing a violin is a pattern of electrical activity in the temporal lobe. The experience of hearing a violin is a world apart, rich, immediate, saturated with feeling, and utterly irreducible to its physical description. This is not a gap in our current knowledge that might be filled by future brain scans. It is a gap in our conceptual framework, a chasm between the objective and the subjective that no amount of third-person data seems able to bridge. To sharpen this, Chalmers invited us to imagine what philosophers call a zombie. And I don't mean the creatures from horror films. A philosophical zombie is a being physically identical to you in every measurable way. Same neurons, same brain chemistry, same behavior. If you poked it, it would say ouch. If you told it a joke, it would laugh. From the outside, there would be no way to tell it apart from a conscious person, but on the inside, there would be nothing. No felt experience, no inner world, just darkness and mechanism. The disturbing thing is that nothing in our current understanding of physics rules this out. If consciousness is merely what happens when matter is arranged in a sufficiently complex way, then why does it happen? What is the extra ingredient that turns information processing into felt experience? Materialists, those who believe everything is ultimately physical, insist that consciousness must emerge from brain complexity the way wetness emerges from water molecules. But critics point out that this is more of a promissory note than an explanation. Saying consciousness emerges from neurons is a bit like saying that a rabbit emerges from a hat. It describes the trick without revealing how it works. Dualists, followers of Descartes, argue that mind and matter are fundamentally different substances. But this creates its own puzzle. If mind is non-physical, how does it interact with the physical brain? How does a thought that weighs nothing cause your arm, which weighs several pounds, to move? Neuroscience has made staggering progress in mapping the correlates of consciousness, the brain patterns that accompany conscious experience. We know, for example, that certain regions of the posterior cortex light up during visual awareness, and that damage to these areas can obliterate specific aspects of experience while leaving others intact. But correlation is not explanation. Knowing that a particular pattern of neural firing accompanies the experience of blue tells us nothing about why that particular pattern produces that particular experience, or why it produces any experience at all. It is as though we have a perfect map of a country but cannot explain why the country exists. And here is where things get interesting. Because when you back the hard problem into a corner, when you exhaust the usual explanations and find them wanting, you arrive at a possibility so radical that it makes even seasoned philosophers uncomfortable. What if consciousness is not produced by the brain at all? What if the brain is not a generator of awareness, but something more like a receiver, a filter, a lens that focuses and shapes a consciousness that exists independently of any particular physical structure? What if, in other words, Mind is not an accidental byproduct of matter, but something fundamental to the nature of reality itself. This idea sounds wild. It sounds like the kind of thing someone might say at 3 in the morning after too much coffee and not enough sleep. But it turns out to be one of the oldest ideas in human thought, and some of the greatest minds in history have defended it with rigorous argument and profound conviction. Nearly 26 centuries ago, on the western coast of what is now Turkey, a man named Thales stood at the edge of the Mediterranean and thought about magnets. Thales of Miletus is often called the first philosopher in the Western tradition, not because he was the first person to think deeply about reality, but because he was among the first to seek natural rather than mythological explanations for the world. And what Thales concluded was startling. He observed that lodestones, naturally magnetic rocks, had the power to move iron without touching it. In his world, the ability to cause motion was a sign of life, of soul. So Thales declared that magnets must possess soul. And from this observation, he drew an extraordinary generalization. All things, he said, are full of gods. This was not the ranting of a primitive mind. It was the first recorded expression of a philosophical position that would echo through the ages. Thales was suggesting that the animating principle we call soul or mind is not confined to human beings or even to living creatures, but pervades the natural world. About 2 centuries later in Athens, Plato gave this idea its most elaborate and beautiful expression. In his dialogue, the Timaeus, Plato describes the creation of the universe by a divine craftsman he calls the demiurge. And what the demiurge creates is not a machine, not a mechanism, not a collection of dead parts moving according to blind law. The demiurge creates a living creature. The cosmos, Plato writes, came into existence as a living creature endowed with soul and reason. A single visible being containing within itself all living creatures that are by nature akin to itself. This is the doctrine of the anima mundi, the world's soul, and it is one of the most influential ideas in the history of Western thought. According to Plato, the world's soul is not merely present within the universe the way your soul is present within your body. It pervades every part of the cosmos, reaching from its center to its outermost extremity and folding it on the outside and revolving within itself. The universe thinks. It feels. It is alive. Plato describes the construction of this world soul in remarkable detail. The demiurge blends 3 ingredients: a substance that is eternal and unchangeable, a substance that is divisible and subject to change, and a third substance intermediate between the two. From this mixture, the craftsman fashions the soul of the cosmos, stretching it out across the entire universe, and then folding the body of the universe within it. The mathematical ratios that structure the world's soul correspond to musical harmonies, suggesting that the cosmos is not merely alive but harmonious, a vast organism singing in mathematical concert. This was not a fringe idea in the ancient world. It was central to some of the most sophisticated philosophical traditions that would follow Plato. The Stoics, who dominated intellectual life in the Hellenistic and Roman periods, took the living universe as a foundational principle of their philosophy. For the Stoics, the cosmos was permeated by an intelligent divine force they called the Logos, a rational principle that organized and animated all things. The Stoics believed that a vital breath, which they called pneuma, flowed through the entire universe, binding it into a single living unity. This pneuma was not merely physical air. It was an intelligent, creative fire that pervaded all matter, giving it form, cohesion, and purpose. At its highest level of organization, in the human mind, pneuma manifested as rational thought. But even in a stone, even in a drop of water, pneuma was present, holding the substance together and giving it its characteristic properties. The Stoics saw the universe as a single organism in which every part was connected to every other part. in which every event was an expression of the rational principle that governed the whole. Their vision had practical consequences. If the universe is one living being, then harming any part of it is harming yourself. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus taught that we should treat every person we meet as a member of the same body, and that injuring another is as irrational as the foot deliberately tripping the hand. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, one of the last great Stoic philosophers, put it with elegant simplicity in his private meditations, a journal never intended for publication, but now read by millions. Think always of the universe as one living creature, he wrote, comprising one substance and one soul. He urged himself to contemplate how all is absorbed into this one consciousness, how a single impulse governs all its actions, how all things collaborate in all that happens, the very web and mesh of it all. These were not idle philosophical musings. Aurelius wrote them by lamplight in his military tent on the frozen frontier of the Roman Empire, while leading campaigns against invading Germanic tribes. He was a man who needed his philosophy to be practical to sustain him through war and plague and personal tragedy. And the idea that sustained him was the idea of a living, conscious, interconnected universe in which every event had meaning and every individual played a role. But the idea of a living, conscious cosmos was not confined to Greece and Rome. Thousands of miles to the east, the ancient Hindu traditions developed a vision of universal consciousness that runs even deeper. In the Upanishads, the oldest philosophical texts of the Indian tradition, we find the concept of Brahman, the ultimate reality that underlies and pervades all things. Brahman is not a personal God in the Western sense. It is consciousness itself, the ground of all being, the awareness within which all experience arises and into which all experience dissolves. The Chandogya Upanishad tells a story that illuminates this idea with extraordinary beauty. A father instructs his son to place a lump of salt in a bowl of water overnight. In the morning, the father asks the son to retrieve the salt. Of course, the salt has dissolved. It cannot be seen or touched. But when the son tastes the water from any point in the bowl, the salt is there. It pervades the entire bowl uniformly, invisibly, completely. That, the father tells his son, is how Brahman pervades all existence. You cannot see it, you cannot isolate it, but it is the essence of everything, and it is what you are. Tat tvam asi, the texts declare. Thou art that. Your deepest self is not separate from the cosmic consciousness. You are the universe experiencing itself through the lens of a particular body and mind. Buddhist philosophy approaches the question differently, but arrives at a strikingly similar insight. The doctrine of dependent origination teaches that nothing exists independently. Every phenomenon arises in dependence upon causes and conditions, which themselves arise in dependence upon further causes and conditions, in an infinite web of mutual arising. The image of Indra's net captures this beautifully. Imagine an infinite net stretching in all directions, with a luminous jewel at every intersection. Each jewel reflects every other jewel, so that the entire net is contained within each single point. Separation is an illusion. The whole is present in every part. The Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh expressed this with characteristic simplicity when he asked his students to look at a piece of paper and see the cloud that rained upon the tree, the sun that fed the tree, the logger who felled the tree, and the wheat that fed the logger. In the single sheet, the entire universe is present. Nothing exists in isolation. Everything inter-is. And across the globe, in traditions too numerous to catalogue, indigenous peoples have lived within what we might call animist worldviews, understanding rivers, mountains, forests, and winds as possessing their own forms of awareness and agency. The Aboriginal Australians speak of the Dreamtime, a living web of consciousness that connects all things in an eternal present. The Lakota Sioux traditionally greet all beings with the phrase mitakuye oyasin, which translates roughly as all my relations, affirming kinship not just with other humans, but with animals, plants, stones, and stars. The Maori of New Zealand recognize the wairua, or spirit, in natural features of the landscape, granting legal personhood to rivers and mountains in a way that baffles Western legal traditions, but makes perfect sense within an animist framework. Western philosophy spent centuries dismissing animism as primitive superstition, a failure to distinguish between living and non-living, between subjects and objects. But as we shall see, the most cutting-edge theories in philosophy of mind are beginning to suggest that the animists may have been closer to the truth than the mechanists who replaced them. The so-called primitive cultures may have been responding to a real feature of the world that Western science, in its eagerness to measure and control, systematically overlooked, because something happened in the 17th century that changed everything. The living cosmos was killed, and a dead one was put in its place. The man most responsible for the murder of the living universe was a French philosopher and mathematician named René Descartes. In the 1630s and 1640s, Descartes constructed a philosophical framework that would shape Western thought for centuries to come. His central move was to divide reality into two fundamentally different kinds of substance. On one side, he placed res cogitans, thinking substance, the realm of mind. On the other, he placed res extensa, extended substance, the realm of matter. Mind thinks but has no physical extension. Matter extends through space but does not think. With this single stroke, Descartes emptied the natural world of consciousness. Animals became complex machines, automatons following mechanical laws with no inner experience. Trees, rivers, stones, and stars lost whatever lingering traces of soul the ancient world had attributed to them. The only mind left in Descartes' universe was the human mind, and even that was trapped inside a physical body with which it had a deeply mysterious connection. Isaac Newton completed the revolution. His laws of motion and universal gravitation described a cosmos governed by precise mathematical rules, a clockwork universe ticking along with perfect predictability. There was no room in Newton's equations for the breath of the Stoic pneuma or the song of Plato's world soul. Nature was machinery, and to understand it was to understand its gears. The Enlightenment embraced this vision with enthusiasm. Science flourished by treating nature as an object to be measured, dissected, and controlled. And the results were spectacular. Within a few centuries, the mechanistic worldview produced electric light, antibiotics, atomic power, and footprints on the moon. Who could argue with success like that? The consequences, however, extended far beyond the laboratory. If nature was a machine, then it had no inherent value beyond its usefulness to human beings. Forests became lumber. Rivers became hydroelectric potential. Animals became biological mechanisms to be studied and exploited. And human beings themselves, in their physical aspect at least, became nothing more than particularly complex arrangements of matter, governed by the same blind laws that moved the planets. The living cosmos of the ancients, in which human beings participated as intimate members of a conscious whole, was replaced by a dead universe in which consciousness was confined to the inside of human skulls. Flickering briefly before being extinguished forever by death, it was, in many ways, the loneliest vision of reality ever devised. But this story, the triumphant march of mechanism over mysticism, is not quite as clean as it is often told. But even as the clockwork cosmos became intellectual orthodoxy, some of the deepest thinkers of the modern era harbored quiet doubts. Baruch Spinoza, Descartes' brilliant contemporary, rejected the division of reality into two substances. There is only one substance, Spinoza argued, and we can call it God or we can call it nature. But mind and matter are not separate things. They are two attributes two aspects of the same underlying reality. Spinoza's God was not a personal deity standing outside creation. Spinoza's God was creation itself, and every rock and leaf and star was a mode and expression of this singular divine substance. For this, Spinoza was excommunicated from his Jewish community, and his works were placed on the Catholic Church's Index of Forbidden Books. But his ideas would not die. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the great German mathematician and philosopher who independently invented calculus at roughly the same time as Newton, proposed another radical alternative. Leibniz argued that reality is composed of fundamental units he called monads, and each monad possesses a kind of perception. Not human-level consciousness, certainly, but an interior, experiential quality. For Leibniz, the universe was not made of dead particles bumping into each other according to mechanical law. It was made of countless centers of experience, each reflecting the whole from its own unique perspective. These ideas smoldered beneath the surface of Western thought for 2 centuries, occasionally flaring into visibility. In the 19th century, the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer argued that reality has two sides: the world as representation, which is the world as we experience it through our senses, and the world as will, which is the inner driving force of all things. This will is not rational or purposeful. It is a blind, striving energy that pervades every level of existence, from the force of gravity to the human desire for food and love and meaning. For Schopenhauer, even the stone falling to earth is expressing will. When a river carves a canyon through rock over millions of years, what we see is not merely the mechanical action of water upon mineral, but a manifestation of the same blind, striving force that drives the roots of trees into soil and propels salmon upstream against impossible currents. The universe, Schopenhauer argued, is not dead matter that happens to contain living things. It is will all the way down, a seething, restless energy that merely disguises itself in the forms of physics and chemistry. William James, the father of American psychology, openly expressed sympathy for panpsychism in the early 20th century, arguing that if we follow the principles of continuity and evolution, we should expect some form of inner experience at every level of natural organization. Evolution, James noted, does not make sudden leaps from nothing to something. If consciousness is present in complex organisms like us, then some precursor of consciousness must exist in simpler organisms, and some precursor of that precursor in still simpler structures, and so on, all the way down to the most elementary physical events. To deny this continuity, James suggested, would be to commit the error of believing that consciousness springs into existence from absolutely nothing, a philosophical miracle no less incredible than any theological one. And then, in the 1920s, two towering figures in British intellectual life made observations that would prove prophetic. Bertrand Russell, one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century, noticed something that had been hiding in plain sight. Physics, Russell pointed out, tells us what matter does. It describes the mathematical structure of physical interactions, but it tells us absolutely nothing about what matter actually is on the inside. Physics describes the extrinsic relational properties of matter, how particles behave in relation to each other, but it is entirely silent about the intrinsic nature of physical reality. There is, Russell suggested, a gap in our understanding, a gap that consciousness might fill. What if the intrinsic nature of matter, the thing that physics leaves out, is experience itself? Arthur Eddington, the astrophysicist who confirmed Einstein's theory of general relativity by observing starlight bending around the sun during the 1919 solar eclipse, went even further. Eddington argued directly that the stuff of the world is mind stuff. Physics, he wrote, describes a world of shadows, mathematical abstractions that capture the structural relationships between things but leave out the substance. Imagine, he suggested, that you are looking at a map of London. The map shows you the streets, the distances, the relative positions of buildings and parks. It is extremely useful for navigation, but it tells you nothing about the smell of the Thames on a summer morning, the sound of footsteps on cobblestones, the feeling of fog against your skin. The map describes the structure of London but omits the substance, the lived reality of what London actually is. Eddington argued that physics gives us a map of the universe but leaves out the substance, and the only substance we actually know from direct acquaintance is consciousness. And the simplest hypothesis is that the substance behind the structural descriptions of physics is the same kind of stuff we know from within. For decades, these ideas were intellectual orphans, admired by a few but taken seriously by almost no one in mainstream philosophy or science. Panpsychism, the view that mind is fundamental and ubiquitous in nature, was dismissed as romantic nonsense, a holdover from pre-scientific thinking. The philosopher Karl Popper called it trivial and grossly misleading. Ludwig Wittgenstein waved it away. John Searle compared it to spreading jam too thinly across the universe. Philosophers and scientists who harbored panpsychist inclinations kept them quiet for fear of professional ridicule. But the hard problem would not go away. And slowly, reluctantly, and then with gathering momentum, the intellectual world began to listen to an idea it had tried very hard to forget. The word panpsychism comes from two Greek roots, pan meaning all, and psyche meaning soul or mind. And the first thing to understand about panpsychism is what it does not claim. Panpsychism does not suggest that your kitchen table is sitting there having deep thoughts about the meaning of existence. It does not claim that electrons have opinions or that rocks dream. What panpsychism proposes is something more subtle but arguably more profound. It suggests that consciousness, or some rudimentary form of experience, is a fundamental feature of the physical world, present in some form at every level of natural organization, much as mass or electrical charge or gravitational attraction are present everywhere in nature. Think of it this way. Every particle in the universe has mass. The mass of an electron is vanishingly small, so small that it plays almost no role in the gravitational dynamics of everyday life. But it is there. It is a real, measurable property of the electron. Now imagine that experience, some absolutely minimal form of what it is like to be, is similarly present at the most basic level of physical reality. Not thought, not emotion, not perception in any sense you would recognize. Something far simpler, far more rudimentary, perhaps something more like a flicker of interiority, a faint shimmer of subjectivity, a minuscule but genuine what it is like to be that thing. At the level of an individual electron, this experience would be so simple as to be unimaginable to a human mind. But when trillions upon trillions of such micro-experiences are organized into the staggeringly complex architecture of a nervous system, something extraordinary emerges. The rich, textured, emotionally saturated consciousness of a living being. Philip Goff, a philosopher at Durham University in England, and one of the leading voices in the modern panpsychist movement, puts it this way. The fundamental building blocks of the universe, perhaps electrons and quarks, have incredibly simple forms of experience. And the very complex experience that characterizes a human brain is somehow built up from these very simple and rudimentary forms. Goff has written extensively about how panpsychism went from being, in his words, laughed at to becoming a serious contender for a theory of consciousness. And the reason for this revival is straightforward. Every other approach to the hard problem seems to hit a wall. Consider the options. If you are a materialist, you believe that consciousness emerges from physical processes in the brain, but no one has been able to explain how or why this emergence occurs. You are left with what philosophers call an explanatory gap, a chasm between the objective description of neural activity and the subjective reality of felt experience. If you are a dualist, you believe that mind and matter are fundamentally different kinds of thing. But then you face the interaction problem. How does something non-physical cause changes in the physical world? And how does the physical world cause changes in non-physical consciousness? Both positions have their strengths, but both leave the deepest questions unanswered. Panpsychism offers a third path. If consciousness is already present at the most fundamental level of reality, then it doesn't need to miraculously emerge from non-conscious matter. The hard problem dissolves, or at least transforms into a different and perhaps more tractable question. Instead of asking how consciousness springs from the non-conscious, we ask how simple forms of experience combine into the complex, unified consciousness that you and I enjoy. This is called the combination problem, and it is currently the central challenge for panpsychist thinkers. How do billions of tiny micro-experiences, each associated with a subatomic particle or a simple physical interaction, come together to form the richly textured, seamlessly unified awareness of a human mind? It is not an easy question, but many philosophers argue it is a more promising question than the hard problem, because at least it starts from the right place. It assumes that the ingredients of consciousness are already present and asks how they are organized, rather than asking how something entirely new springs from nothing. The history of panpsychism is not merely an intellectual history. It is also a story of remarkable courage in the face of deadly opposition. In the year 1600, in the Campo de' Fiori in Rome, a man was brought before a crowd, gagged so that he could not speak his final words, tied to a wooden stake, and set on fire. His name was Giordano Bruno. He was a Dominican friar, a mathematician, a poet, and a philosopher who had committed what the Inquisition considered an unforgivable sin. He had looked at the night sky and declared that the universe was infinite, that the stars were suns with their own planets, and that the cosmos was alive, animated by a universal soul that pervaded all matter. Bruno drew on the Hermetic tradition, on ancient Egyptian wisdom, on the Neoplatonists, and on his own extraordinary intuition to construct a vision of reality in which mind and matter were inseparable, in which the universe was a single living organism, and in which every part of creation participated in the divine life. He wandered across Europe for years, teaching, debating, writing, and making enemies wherever he went. He was brilliantly original, personally abrasive, and utterly unwilling to compromise his convictions. The authorities offered him the chance to recant. He refused. When the sentence of death was read to him, Bruno reportedly told his judges, "Perhaps you who pronounce my sentence are in greater fear than I who receive it." They gagged him so that the crowd would not hear his final words, and they burned him alive on the 17th of February, 1600, in the center of Rome. More than 4 centuries later, the idea that got Giordano Bruno killed is being debated in the seminar rooms of Oxford, Cambridge, New York University, and MIT. It appears in peer-reviewed journals and at prestigious international conferences. Philip Goff's book on the subject became a bestseller. The neuroscientist Christoph Koch, who served as president of the Allen Institute for Brain Science, has publicly stated that he considers panpsychism the most elegant explanation for consciousness he has encountered. The wheel of intellectual fortune has turned in ways that Bruno could not have imagined, though whether it would bring him any comfort is another question entirely. But here is where the story takes another unexpected turn. Because within the panpsychist camp, a growing number of thinkers are arguing that the standard version of panpsychism, the one that starts with micro-experiences at the bottom and tries to build upward to complex consciousness, may have things exactly backward. What if consciousness does not begin at the bottom, with quarks and electrons, and build upward to brains and minds? What if it begins at the very top, with the cosmos itself, and filters downward into the limited, localized perspectives that you and I experience? This is the position known as cosmopsychism, and it represents one of the most fascinating developments in recent philosophy of mind. The core idea of cosmopsychism is deceptively simple. The universe as a whole is the fundamental subject of experience. It is the first mind, the original consciousness. Individual minds, including yours and mine, are not built up from countless tiny experiences combining from below. Instead, they are something more like limitations, or localizations, or windows carved into a vast and encompassing cosmic awareness. To understand this, it helps to set aside the usual way we think about parts and wholes. Normally, we assume that wholes are built from parts. A house is built from bricks. A body is built from cells. A society is built from individuals. And we tend to carry this assumption into our thinking about consciousness. Complex minds are built from simple experiences, just as complex structures are built from simple components. But cosmopsychism reverses this logic. It says that the whole, the cosmos, comes first, and the parts, individual minds, are derived from it. Think of it this way. Imagine an ocean, boundless, deep, and endlessly in motion. Now imagine that within this ocean, there are whirlpools. Each whirlpool has its own distinct pattern, its own center, its own way of drawing the surrounding water into its spiral. From within the whirlpool, the water might seem contained, separate, defined. But it is never truly separate from the ocean. The whirlpool is the ocean, expressing itself in a particular localized pattern. In cosmopsychism, your consciousness is like that whirlpool. It feels bounded, personal, uniquely yours, but it is a localized expression of a universal awareness that extends far beyond the boundaries of your skull. One of the most rigorous formulations of this idea comes from the philosopher Luke Roelofs, who proposes what he calls continuous panpsychism, or simply continuism. Roelofs argues that while human consciousness is informationally bounded, meaning it is causally and functionally distinct from other consciousnesses, it is likely phenomenally unbounded. In other words, your experience is part of a single continuous field of experience that encompasses the entire universe. Individual subjects exist as informationally dense regions within this field, like knots in an infinite web. The illusion that our minds are separate, sealed-off bubbles of awareness, is caused by our informational isolation, not by any fundamental break in the fabric of consciousness itself. This might sound exotic, but it maps remarkably well onto some of the oldest spiritual insights in human history. When the Hindu sages declared, Tat Tiwam Asi, thou art that, they were expressing precisely this cosmopsychist insight, that the individual soul and the cosmic soul are not two different things, but one reality experienced from different vantage points. When the Sufi mystic Rumi wrote that you are not a drop in the ocean but the entire ocean in a drop, he was articulating the same reversal of perspective that cosmopsychism proposes. Your consciousness does not build up from particles below. It flows down from a reality above, or rather around, within, and through everything. Cosmopsychism also has an elegant advantage over standard panpsychism. It avoids the combination problem entirely. If you start from the bottom, with billions of micro-experiences, you have to explain how these tiny sparks of awareness combine into the unified, seamless experience of a single mind. No one has convincingly solved this puzzle. But if you start from the top, with a unified cosmic consciousness, you face a different and arguably simpler question. How does this unified awareness decompose, or filter, or localize into the limited perspectives that individual creatures experience? This is sometimes called the decombination problem, and while it is still challenging, many philosophers find it more tractable than its counterpart. After all, we have everyday examples of wholes decomposing into parts, of unified systems producing differentiated components. What we have far fewer examples of is disconnected parts spontaneously generating a new unified whole with properties that none of the parts individually possess. But philosophy, however brilliant, operates in the realm of argument and speculation. The question that presses upon us is whether science, with its demand for evidence and testability, has anything to say about the consciousness of the cosmos. And the answer begins in what may be the most celebrated and most confounding experiment in the history of physics. Imagine a wall with two narrow slits cut into it, and behind the wall, a screen that records where particles land. Now imagine firing tiny particles, say electrons, one at a time, toward this wall. Each electron is so small that it passes through the apparatus individually, with no other electron nearby. Common sense tells you what should happen. Each electron should pass through one slit or the other, like a tiny bullet. And after many electrons have been fired, you should see two bands of hits on the screen behind the wall, one corresponding to each slit, but that is not what happens. When scientists performed this experiment, they found something that defied every expectation. The pattern on the screen was not two bands, but an interference pattern, a series of alternating bright and dark fringes that is characteristic of waves, not particles. Somehow, each individual electron was behaving as if it passed through both slits simultaneously, interfered with itself like a wave, and then arrived at the screen as a single particle. This is strange enough, but the truly bewildering part comes next. When scientists placed a detector at the slits to observe which slit each electron actually passed through, the interference pattern vanished. The electrons began behaving like ordinary particles passing through one slit or the other and producing the two simple bands that common sense predicted. The mere act of observation, of gaining information about which slit the electron chose, fundamentally altered the electron's behavior. Sit with that for a moment. A single electron, fired through a barrier, behaves as a wave when nobody is watching, and as a particle when somebody is. It is as though the electron knows whether it is being observed. It is as though the act of looking changes the nature of what is seen. This is not a metaphor. It is not an interpretation. It is the raw experimental result, confirmed thousands of times in laboratories around the world, with electrons, with photons, with atoms, and even with molecules large enough to be seen under a microscope. The universe, at its most fundamental level, seems to care whether information about it is being gathered, and no one can fully explain why. This is the double-slit experiment, first performed with light by Thomas Young in 1801, and later replicated with electrons, atoms, and even large molecules. It remains one of the most startling demonstrations in all of science, and it raises a question that has haunted physics for over a century. What counts as an observation? What is it about the act of measurement that forces a quantum system to choose a definite state? In the early decades of quantum mechanics, two of the field's towering figures, the Hungarian-American physicist Eugene Wigner and the legendary mathematician John von Neumann, argued that consciousness itself was the key. According to their interpretation, a quantum system remains in an indeterminate state, a superposition of all possible outcomes, until a conscious observer becomes aware of it. It is the act of conscious observation that collapses the wave function, forcing the system to settle into one definite reality. If this interpretation is correct, consciousness is not a late arrival in the cosmic story, an accidental byproduct of evolution on one small planet. Consciousness is woven into the deepest laws of physics. Without it, the universe would remain an indeterminate cloud of overlapping possibilities, never resolving into the definite, concrete reality we experience. Now it is essential to be honest about the current state of this debate. Most working physicists today do not accept the consciousness causes collapse interpretation. The mainstream view is that observation in quantum mechanics simply means interaction with a measuring device, any physical system that records information about the quantum state. A detector, a photon, Even another subatomic particle can serve as an observer. No conscious mind is required. The phenomenon known as decoherence, in which a quantum system becomes entangled with its environment and loses its ability to exhibit interference effects, provides a mechanistic explanation that does not invoke consciousness at all. And yet, the debate is far from settled. The Nobel Prize-winning physicist Roger Penrose, working with the anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff, has proposed a theory called orchestrated objective reduction, which suggests that consciousness arises from quantum processes occurring within structures called microtubules inside neurons. Penrose argues that these quantum events are governed by the fine structure of space-time itself, connecting consciousness to the most fundamental level of physical reality. The theory remains controversial, but it demonstrates that serious scientists are willing to entertain deep connections between consciousness and the quantum world. And then there is the delayed choice quantum eraser experiment, which adds another layer of strangeness. In this experiment, the decision about whether to observe which path a particle takes can be made after the particle has already been detected on the screen. And remarkably, the choice seems to retroactively affect whether an interference pattern appears or not. The future choice influences the past outcome. This does not necessarily mean that consciousness travels backward in time, but it does suggest that the relationship between observation, information, and physical reality is far more intimate and far more strange than our everyday intuitions would suggest. Even if we set aside the most dramatic interpretations, the quantum world reveals something profound. At the most fundamental level of physical reality, the sharp distinction between the observer and the observed breaks down. Information, measurement, and the act of knowing are not external additions to a pre-existing physical world. They are part of the story from the beginning. The physicist John Archibald Wheeler, one of the great figures of 20th century physics, captured this insight with a provocative phrase. He described the universe as a participatory universe, a cosmos in which the act of observation is not something that happens to an already existing reality, but something that helps bring reality into being. Wheeler imagined the universe as a giant feedback loop. The cosmos gives rise to observers through the process of evolution, and observers, through the process of measurement, help give the cosmos its definite character. In Wheeler's vision, the universe does not sit there waiting to be discovered. It comes into focus through the act of being known. This is not mysticism. Wheeler was as hard-nosed a physicist as the 20th century produced. He worked on the Manhattan Project, coined the term black hole, and spent decades refining the mathematical foundations of general relativity. But when he looked at the implications of quantum mechanics, he concluded that the universe is not a thing, but a process, and that consciousness is not a spectator of that process, but a participant in it. Which brings us to what may be the most ambitious attempt in the history of science to put consciousness on a rigorous mathematical footing. In 2004, the neuroscientist Giulio Tononi, working at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, published a theory that he called Integrated Information Theory, or IIT, and its central claim is as bold as anything we have encountered tonight. Consciousness, Tononi proposed, is not produced by the brain. Consciousness is identical to a specific kind of information, integrated information, which he measures using a mathematical quantity he calls phi. Tononi begins not with the brain or with physics, but with consciousness itself. He identifies 5 properties that he considers self-evidently true of any conscious experience. First, consciousness exists. This is the one thing you cannot doubt, the bedrock certainty that Descartes identified 4 centuries ago. Second, consciousness is structured. Your experience at any moment contains a rich variety of qualities: colors, sounds, emotions, thoughts, all woven together into a complex composition. Third, consciousness is informative. Each conscious experience specifies a particular state of affairs that is different from all other possible states. Seeing a blue sky is a different experience from seeing a red sunset, and your consciousness makes this distinction naturally. Fourth, consciousness is integrated. You don't experience the color of the sky separately from the warmth of the sun and the sound of birdsong. These are unified in a single, seamless field of experience. And fifth, consciousness is exclusive. At any given moment, you have one particular experience and not another. The boundaries of your current experience are definite. From these five axioms, Tononi derives corresponding postulates about what a physical system must be like to be conscious. The system must have cause-effect power upon itself. It must integrate information in a way that cannot be reduced to the information processed by its parts independently. And the amount of consciousness a system possesses is measured by phi, the quantity of integrated information the system generates above and beyond what its parts generate separately. The implications are startling. According to IIT, any physical system that integrates information, no matter how simple, possesses some degree of consciousness. A photodiode that distinguishes between light and dark has a tiny, almost infinitesimally small amount of phi, and therefore, according to the theory, a correspondingly tiny flicker of experience. A thermostat that responds to temperature changes has a bit more. A human brain, with its staggeringly complex web of interconnected neurons generating vast quantities of integrated information, has an enormous amount. Theoretical computer scientist Scott Aronson has pointed out that according to IIT's own mathematics, a large grid of simple logic gates, even if it is not doing anything at all, could have a higher phi value than a human brain, simply because of the way the gates are interconnected. Tononi acknowledged this result and, rather than backing away from it, embraced it as consistent with the theory. If consciousness is integrated information, then the architecture of a system matters more than its behavior. This is an astonishing claim, and it has not gone unchallenged. In 2023, a letter signed by 124 scholars was published arguing that IIT lacks sufficient empirical support to be considered a legitimate scientific theory. Some went further, calling it unfalsifiable pseudoscience. But defenders of IIT pushed back vigorously, pointing to clinical studies where phi-based measurements have been used to assess consciousness in patients who show no behavioral signs of awareness, with results that corroborate the theory's predictions. And in a 2005 paper, Tononi and his colleague Melanie Bowley reframed IIT as what they called a consciousness-first approach to what exists. Rather than starting with physics and trying to explain consciousness, IIT starts with consciousness, the one thing we know with certainty to exist, and works outward to derive what the physical world must be like in order to give rise to it. Whether or not IIT ultimately proves correct, it represents something remarkable in the history of ideas. It takes consciousness seriously as a fundamental feature of reality, rather than an embarrassing afterthought to be explained away. And it leans, unmistakably, in the direction of panpsychism. If consciousness is integrated information, and if even simple systems integrate some information, then some form of experience is present everywhere. The universe, from its smallest components to its largest structures, is lit from within. There is something poetic in this scientific proposition, something that would have delighted both the ancient Stoics and the modern mystics. The idea that the quantity of consciousness in a system depends not on what the system is made of, but on how it is organized, suggests that mind is not a substance but a pattern, not a thing but a relationship. A brain made of neurons and a hypothetical computer made of silicon chips, if they integrate information in the same way, would share the same quality of experience. What matters is not the material, but the music it plays. This resonates with something deep in the human intuition about consciousness, that it is not a product of flesh and blood, but something more fundamental, something that uses physical structures as its instruments but is not reducible to them. And if this is correct, then the universe is not merely a stage upon which consciousness performs. The universe is the performance itself, an infinite symphony of integrated information, playing itself into existence at every scale, from the simplest quantum interaction to the most complex thought ever formed in a human brain. And with that thought, we arrive at a figure who may have been the most extraordinary visionary of the 20th century, a man who saw all of this coming before any of it had a name. A Jesuit priest who spent his days digging up dinosaur bones in the deserts of China, and his nights dreaming of the moment when the universe would finally become aware of itself. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin was born in 1881 in the Auvergne region of central France, the fourth of 11 children in a deeply Catholic family. From his earliest years, two passions defined him. One was a fascination with rocks. As a small boy, he would collect pieces of iron and quartz, holding them with something approaching reverence, as though these hard, enduring fragments of the earth contained a secret that he needed to understand. The other passion was God. At 17, he entered the Jesuit order, committing his life to the religious vocation. What makes Teilhard remarkable, and what made him dangerous in the eyes of his own church, is that he refused to let these two passions remain separate. He became a paleontologist of genuine distinction, participating in the discovery of Peking man in China, one of the most significant fossil finds of the 20th century. But he was also a mystic, a visionary, who looked at the fossil record and saw not merely the mechanical accumulation of biological change, but a purposeful movement, a cosmic surge toward greater complexity and deeper consciousness. And from this double vision, he constructed a theory of reality so sweeping, so beautiful, and so unsettling that the Catholic Church forbade the publication of his philosophical writings during his lifetime. Teilhard's central insight was breathtakingly simple. Evolution, he argued, is not merely biological, it is cosmic, and it has a direction. From the first moments after the Big Bang, matter has been organizing itself into structures of increasing complexity. Hydrogen atoms fused into helium in the hearts of early stars. Heavier elements were forged in the furnaces of stellar death and scattered across space. These elements combined into molecules, molecules into amino acids into the first stirrings of life. Single cells gave way to multicellular organisms, simple nervous systems to complex brains, instinct to reason, reason to self-awareness. At every step, increasing complexity was accompanied by increasing consciousness. Teilhard called this the law of complexity consciousness. It was not, he insisted, a mystical add-on to Darwinian evolution. It was the deepest pattern of evolution itself. Matter was not dead stuff that accidentally stumbled into awareness. Matter was proto-conscious from the beginning, carrying within it the potential for mind, and evolution was the process by which this potential was progressively realized. Teilhard mapped this cosmic trajectory through four great stages. The first was the geosphere, the layer of inanimate matter that formed the early Earth, rocks and water and gases obeying the laws of chemistry and physics. The second was the biosphere, the layer of living things that emerged from and enveloped the geosphere, transforming the surface of the planet into a web of interconnected organisms. The third stage, the one that captured Teilhard's imagination most powerfully, was the noosphere, a word he coined from the Greek nous, meaning mind. The noosphere is the layer of thought, the collective sphere of human consciousness that began forming when Homo sapiens evolved the capacity for reflective awareness. And with each century, as human communication became more dense, more rapid, more interconnected, the noosphere grew thicker, more complex, more alive. Imagine a time-lapse film of Earth seen from space, compressed so that each second represents 1,000 years. You would see the continents slowly drift. You would see ice ages pulse across the surface and retreat. And then, very recently in geological terms, you would see something new. Tiny pinpoints of light appearing along coastlines and river valleys, flickering and spreading. Cities, roads, trade networks, ship routes, telegraph lines, railway tracks. And then, in the very last fraction of a second, an explosion, radio waves, television signals, fiber optic cables, satellite links, and the incandescent glow of the internet, wrapping the planet in a luminous web of information and connection. That acceleration, that exponential thickening of human interconnection, is exactly what Teilhard described as the formation of the noosphere. When Teilhard described the noosphere in the 1920s and 1930s, the internet did not exist. Television did not exist. Satellite communication did not exist. And yet his description of the noosphere, a thinking layer enveloping the Earth, growing denser with every new connection between human minds, reads today like a prophecy of the digital age. He wrote of humanity being drawn into increasingly collective forms of consciousness, of media technologies becoming the nervous system of a world consciousness striving to be born. He predicted a period of rapid technological change that would result in a merger of humanity and its tools, creating what he called the spirit of the earth. Reading Teilhard today, you might be forgiven for thinking he had somehow glimpsed the World Wide Web 60 years before it was invented. But Teilhard did not stop at the noosphere. He believed that evolution was aimed at an ultimate destination, a point of final convergence, that he called the omega point. At the omega point, all of creation would achieve perfect unity. Consciousness, having evolved from the first flickers of experience in primordial matter through the expanding web of human thought, would finally converge into something that transcended all individual minds while including and perfecting each of them. The omega point was not merely a future state. Teilhard believed it was already present in some sense, already exerting a gravitational pull on the evolutionary process, drawing consciousness forward and upward toward unity. Just as gravity draws matter together across space, the omega point draws consciousness together across time. Every act of connection, every deepening of understanding, every expansion of empathy and love is a response to this cosmic attraction. Evolution, in Teilhard's vision, is not a blind process stumbling forward through random mutation and natural selection. It is a love story, a vast cosmic romance in which matter yearns toward mind and mind yearns toward unity. And the whole great sweep of 13.8 billion years of cosmic history is the unfolding of this yearning. For Teilhard, a Christian, the omega point was Christ, the Logos, the cosmic principle of love and intelligence, that was both the origin and the destination of the evolutionary journey. But even stripped of its specifically Christian imagery, Teilhard's vision retains extraordinary power. It suggests that the universe is going somewhere, that the emergence of consciousness is not an accident, but the central theme of the cosmic story, and that the direction of evolution points toward ever deeper connection, ever greater awareness, and ultimately, the awakening of the universe to itself. Teilhard died in New York City on Easter Sunday, 1955. He had spent his final years in a kind of internal exile, forbidden by his Jesuit superiors from publishing his philosophical works, unable to accept academic positions that would have given him a platform for his ideas. He died in a small apartment on Park Avenue, attended by a cousin, far from the deserts of China, where he had made his greatest scientific discoveries, and far from the France of his birth. It was, by most external measures, a lonely ending for one of the most extraordinary minds of his century. But Teilhard had written years earlier that the only way to discover the omega point was through the surrender of the individual self into something greater. Perhaps his quiet death on the day Christians celebrate resurrection was, in his own terms, a final act of coherence between his beliefs and his life. Within a decade of his death, his books were released posthumously and exploded into global prominence. The Phenomenon of Man, his masterwork, was translated into dozens of languages and read by millions. Salvador Dali, the great surrealist painter, was fascinated by the Omega Point and incorporated it into his art. Pope Benedict XVI, in a 2009 homily, approvingly referenced Teilhard's vision of cosmic liturgy, suggesting that the Church was slowly coming to terms with the priest it had once silenced. And in the world of technology and artificial intelligence, Teilhard's vision of convergent consciousness has found enthusiastic new advocates who see in the Internet, in global communication networks, in the emerging possibilities of artificial intelligence, the early stages of the noosphere becoming conscious of itself. Teilhard looked at evolution and saw consciousness growing toward unity. But another scientific visionary working a generation later looked not upward toward the stars but downward, at the ground beneath his feet, and asked a complementary question. What if the Earth itself is already alive? James Lovelock was a British inventor and atmospheric chemist who, in the early 1970s, proposed what he called the Gaia hypothesis, named after the Greek goddess of the Earth. Lovelock's central observation was startling in its simplicity. The Earth's atmosphere, its oceans, its temperature, and its chemical composition are maintained within remarkably narrow ranges that are optimal for life. And these ranges have been maintained not for thousands of years, but for hundreds of millions of years, through ice ages and volcanic cataclysms, through the rise and fall of entire categories of organisms. This, Lovelock argued, is not what you would expect from a dead planet governed by blind chemistry and physics. Consider oxygen. The Earth's atmosphere contains approximately 20 to 1% oxygen. This is a peculiar number. If the concentration dropped below about 15%, fires could not sustain themselves and many organisms would suffocate. If it rose above about 25%, even damp vegetation would ignite, and the surface of the planet would become an inferno. Yet for hundreds of millions of years, oxygen has been held within this narrow band, despite the fact that oxygen is a highly reactive gas that would, without active replenishment, quickly combine with surface minerals and disappear from the atmosphere entirely. Something is regulating this balance, and that something is life itself. Photosynthetic organisms produce oxygen. Respiring organisms consume it. The balance is maintained through an intricate feedback loop involving billions of organisms interacting with the atmosphere, the oceans, and the solid Earth. Or consider ocean salinity. The salt content of the world's oceans has remained at approximately 3.4% for an enormously long time. Rivers continuously wash minerals from the land into the sea, which should steadily increase the ocean's saltiness. Yet it does not increase. Instead, the salinity is regulated through complex interactions between marine organisms, geological processes, and atmospheric chemistry that together form a self-correcting system remarkably similar to the homeostatic mechanisms that maintain stable conditions within a living body. Lovelock illustrated these principles with a thought experiment he called Daisy World. Imagine a planet orbiting a star that is slowly getting brighter and hotter over time. On this planet live two types of daisies, black daisies and white daisies. When the star is relatively cool, black daisies have an advantage because their dark petals absorb more heat. As they spread across the planet, they warm the surface, making conditions more hospitable. But as the star grows hotter, white daisies begin to thrive because their pale petals reflect sunlight. As white daisies spread, they cool the planet. The result is a temperature regulation system that requires no central controller, no thermostat, no conscious planning. Simple organisms, responding to local conditions, collectively regulate the global environment. Daisy World is an abstraction, of course, but the principle it demonstrates operates throughout the real Earth system, in feedback loops of staggering complexity involving billions of organisms, atmospheric gases, ocean currents, and geological processes, all interacting to maintain the conditions for life. Lovelock's collaborator, the biologist Lynn Margulis, added a crucial dimension to this picture. Margulis argued that the driving force of evolution was not merely competition but symbiosis, the cooperative merging of different organisms into new, more complex wholes. The cells in your body contain mitochondria, the tiny organelles that generate your cellular energy. Margulis demonstrated that mitochondria were once free-living bacteria that entered into a symbiotic relationship with ancient cells, eventually becoming permanently incorporated into them. Your very existence depends on an act of cooperation between different life forms that occurred over 1 billion years ago. Life, Margulis showed, advances not only through the survival of the fittest, but through the merger of the cooperative. Taken together, Lovelock and Margulis painted a portrait of Earth as something more than a ball of rock with a thin coating of organisms. They described a planet that behaves as an integrated, self-regulating system in which living and non-living components are so thoroughly intertwined that the distinction between them becomes blurred. The Gaia hypothesis does not necessarily claim that the Earth is conscious. It does not need to. What it demonstrates is that the boundary between living and non-living systems is far less clear than the mechanistic worldview would have us believe. If the entire planet functions as a single self-regulating organism, then the mechanical picture of nature as dead matter following blind laws begins to dissolve. And if this is true of the Earth, what about the solar system? What about the galaxy? What about the universe as a whole? The astrophysicist Lee Smolin has proposed that the universe may even reproduce, that black holes might give birth to new universes with slightly different physical constants, creating a kind of cosmic natural selection in which universes that are better at producing complexity and stars are more likely to produce offspring. If this speculative but fascinating idea has any merit, then the universe begins to look less like a machine and more like a living system at the grandest possible scale, evolving, adapting, and reproducing in ways that mirror the biological processes we observe on Earth. We do not need to accept every one of these ideas to feel their cumulative force. Taken together, they suggest that the mechanistic picture of reality, the dead clockwork universe of Newton and Descartes, is not so much wrong as incomplete. It captures something real about the mathematical regularities of nature, but it misses something equally real about the interiority, the aliveness, the experiential depth that may permeate the physical world at every level. All of these threads, the ancient philosophical visions of a living cosmos, the hard problem that materialist science cannot solve, the panpsychist revival, the quantum mysteries, the information-theoretic approaches to consciousness, Teilhard's evolutionary vision, and the self-regulating behavior of our own planet converge on a single, extraordinary possibility. The universe may be not merely a vast arrangement of matter and energy governed by impersonal laws, but something more like a living, breathing, conscious entity, of which every atom, every organism, every mind is an intimate expression. And if this is true, even approximately, even partially, even as a direction of thought rather than a settled conclusion, then it changes everything about how we understand ourselves and our place in the cosmic order. If the universe is conscious, then the environmental crisis takes on a new and terrible urgency. The destruction of rainforests and coral reefs, the poisoning of rivers and oceans, the extinction of species, these are not merely practical problems or even moral failures. They are something like self-mutilation, the conscious universe damaging its own body. The web of life that sustains our planet is not a resource to be exploited, but an expression of the same awareness that looks out through your eyes at this very moment. To harm it is to harm ourselves in the deepest possible sense. If the universe is conscious, then loneliness, that epidemic of the modern world, reveals itself as something close to an illusion. You are not an isolated spark of awareness stranded in a vast, indifferent void. You are a focal point of cosmic consciousness, a place where the universe is experiencing itself with particular intensity and specificity. The awareness that you feel is not different in kind from the awareness that pervades all things. It is a concentrated, localized, richly complex version of the same fundamental reality that exists in the simplest electron and the most distant star. You have never been alone. You cannot be alone. The very fabric of existence is woven from the same thread of experience that constitutes your innermost self. Think about what this means in practical terms. When you stand in a forest, surrounded by trees whose roots intertwine beneath the soil and whose branches reach toward the same sky, you are not merely an observer of a biological system. You are a conscious being in the presence of other forms of consciousness, sharing a moment of mutual existence. When you look up at the night sky and see the light of stars that burned millions of years before your birth, you are not staring into emptiness. You are gazing into a field of awareness in which every photon that strikes your retina has traveled from a source that, however dimly, participates in the same cosmic consciousness that animates your perception. The loneliness that pervades modern life, the sense that each of us is trapped in a private bubble of awareness with no bridge to the inner lives of others, may be not a fundamental truth about reality, but a symptom of a worldview that has lost touch with something essential about the nature of mind. If consciousness is fundamental, if it is not generated by the brain but is a basic feature of reality that brains filter, focus, and amplify, then the question of what happens when the brain ceases to function takes on a profoundly different character. In the materialist picture, death is the end of consciousness, because consciousness is produced by the brain. When the producer stops working, the product vanishes. But if consciousness is fundamental, then the end of brain activity may be more like the breaking of a lens or the turning of a radio dial than the extinguishing of a flame. The awareness that looked through your eyes may continue, transformed, diffused, perhaps merged back into the cosmic consciousness from which it was temporarily differentiated. This is not a proof of an afterlife. It is not a scientific demonstration of survival beyond death, but it opens a philosophical space that pure materialism forecloses, and it resonates with the intuitions of virtually every wisdom tradition that humanity has ever produced. And perhaps most personally, if the universe is conscious, then you are not an accident. This point deserves to be lingered over, because so much of modern anxiety flows from the feeling that human existence is ultimately meaningless, a brief flicker of awareness in an indifferent void, signifying nothing. The mechanistic worldview, for all its scientific power, offers cold comfort to the human heart. It tells us that we are arrangements of atoms obeying physical laws, that our thoughts and feelings are epiphenomena of neural computation, and that the universe neither knows nor cares that we exist. Panpsychism and cosmopsychism offer a radically different picture. If consciousness is fundamental, then the existence of your particular perspective, your unique way of experiencing reality, is not a meaningless fluke in an indifferent cosmos. You are the universe knowing itself through your eyes, feeling itself through your body, thinking itself through your mind. The joys you experience are the universe's joys. The sorrows you carry are the universe's sorrows. Your acts of kindness ripple outward through a field of awareness that extends to the farthest reaches of space and time. In every moment of genuine love, the cosmos touches itself with tenderness. In every flash of insight, the universe grows a little more transparent to its own nature. This convergence, this remarkable meeting of ancient wisdom and modern inquiry, may be one of the most significant developments in the long history of human thought. The Hindu sage who declared Tat Tvam Asi, and the quantum physicist who cannot find a clear boundary between the observer and the observed, the Stoic emperor who meditated on the unity of all things, and the neuroscientist who measures the integrated information of neural networks, the indigenous elder who speaks to the river, and the philosopher who argues that experience is fundamental to matter. All of these voices, separated by centuries and continents, and seemingly incompatible worldviews, may have been describing the same reality in the only languages available to them. Science and spirituality, reason and revelation, the microscope and the prayer bead, may not be opposed paths to understanding, but complementary windows onto a reality too vast and too intimate for any single perspective to contain. There is something deeply moving about this possibility. For centuries, we have been told that science and spirituality are enemies, that to be rational is to be disenchanted, that the price of understanding the world is the loss of wonder. But the story we have traced tonight suggests something different. The more deeply science probes the nature of consciousness and the foundations of physical reality, the more it finds itself circling back toward questions that mystics and sages have been exploring for millennia. This is not because science is failing. It is because reality itself is deeper and stranger than the mechanistic framework assumed, and the ancient seers, for all their limitations, may have been attuned to dimensions of existence that the scientific method is only now beginning to approach. Consider what it would mean to wake up each morning in a conscious universe. The sunlight streaming through your window would not be mere electromagnetic radiation bouncing off surfaces. It would be a transmission between two expressions of the same fundamental awareness. The star and the perceiver connected by something deeper than photons. The food on your table would not be dead matter to be consumed, but living presence to be received with gratitude. The strangers you pass on the street would not be separate, isolated beings trapped in their own skulls, but fellow vortices in the great river of cosmic consciousness, each one a unique and irreplaceable perspective on the whole. Even suffering, that great challenge to any vision of cosmic meaning, takes on a different quality in a conscious universe. Pain remains real, loss remains devastating, injustice remains intolerable. But these experiences are not suffered alone, and they are not suffered in vain. They are felt by a cosmos that includes you, that is aware of you, that in some sense is you. The universe grieves with every mother who loses a child. The cosmos winces with every creature in pain. This does not eliminate suffering, but it places suffering within a context of meaning that pure materialism can never provide. And now, dear friends, as the ideas we have explored tonight begin to settle like stars into the darkening sky of your awareness, let us allow the pace of our thinking to slow. Let the arguments relax their grip. Let the names and theories and experiments drift into the background, leaving only the gentle mystery of this present moment. Notice your breathing. The air flowing into your lungs carries atoms that were forged in the nuclear furnaces of stars that died billions of years ago. Carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, all of these elements were cooked in stellar cores and scattered across space in supernova explosions before gravity gathered them again into the planet that became your home, and eventually into the body that you call your own. If panpsychism is true, if even the simplest forms of matter carry some whisper of experience, then the atoms that compose you have been on a journey of awareness that stretches back to the very beginning of the universe. The cosmos has been dreaming its way toward you for 13.8 billion years. As your consciousness shifts now from the focused attention of waking thought toward the softer, more diffuse awareness of approaching sleep, you participate in the very mystery we have been contemplating. Sleep is not the absence of consciousness. It is a transformation of consciousness, a shift from one mode of experience to another. Your awareness does not vanish when you close your eyes. It changes form. It loosens, expands, and enters territories that waking thought cannot reach. Dreams bring their own kind of knowing, their own strange logic, their own encounters with aspects of reality that the rational mind holds at a distance during the day. If the universe is conscious, then sleep is not a withdrawal from cosmic participation, but a quieter, deeper form of it. The boundary between your awareness and the larger awareness that holds all things together grows thinner as waking thought releases its grip. You do not disappear into sleep. You dissolve gently and temporarily back toward the source. Think for a moment about what happens in your body as you approach sleep. Your heart rate slows, your breathing deepens and becomes more rhythmic. The muscles that held tension throughout the day gradually release their grip. Your brain waves shift from the rapid, irregular patterns of waking thought to the slower, more synchronized rhythms of relaxation. The frontal lobe, that busy executive director of your conscious life, begins to quiet. And as it does, the sharp boundaries between self and world soften. This is not loss, this is return. Each night, your consciousness performs a remarkable act of trust. It releases its hold on the external world, on the catalogs of worry and planning and evaluation that occupy the daylight hours, and allows itself to be gathered back into something deeper and more restful than any waking state can provide. If consciousness is fundamental to the universe, then perhaps sleep is the body's way of letting you remember, however briefly and however dimly, what you truly are beneath the surface of daily identity. Not a separate self struggling against an indifferent cosmos, but a temporary and beloved concentration of the universe's own awareness, resting now in the embrace from which it came. The philosophers and scientists whose ideas we have explored tonight would each describe this differently. Plato might say that in sleep, the soul loosens its attachment to the sensible world and draws closer to the eternal forms. The Stoics might say that in sleep, the individual pneuma relaxes into the cosmic pneuma that permeates all things. Teilhard might say that in sleep, individual consciousness momentarily softens its boundaries and touches the noosphere. Tononi might say that in sleep, the integration of information in your brain shifts to different patterns, generating different forms of experience. But beneath these different vocabularies, there is a shared intuition that the consciousness you carry is not yours alone, and that in the quiet of sleep, the illusion of separation grows thin. Let the gentle weight of this possibility rest upon you like a warm blanket. You do not need to decide tonight whether the universe is alive. You do not need to choose between panpsychism and materialism, between Plato and Newton, between the quantum physicist and the Stoic sage. These are questions for wakeful minds and wakeful hours. For now, it is enough to rest within the question itself, to let it hold you the way the night holds the earth, quietly, patiently, without demanding resolution. If these nighttime reflections have brought you a measure of peace, or curiosity, or the gentle sense that reality may be stranger and more wonderful than you had imagined, I hope you will consider sharing this journey with someone who might need it. A like helps this video reach others who are seeking calm in the stillness of evening. Subscribing ensures that you will be here when we next gather to explore the wisdom of the ages. And your presence in this quiet community of nighttime philosophers means more than you know. Tomorrow, you will wake to a world that may or may not be conscious, that may or may not be alive in the deepest sense of the word. But tonight, as you drift toward sleep, you carry within you the combined wisdom of Plato and Teilhard, of Tononi and the ancient sages, of all those who have looked at the cosmos and seen not dead machinery, but a living presence looking back. The questions we have explored tonight will not be resolved in our lifetime. They may never be resolved in a way that satisfies the demands of rigorous proof, but they do not need to be resolved to change the way you experience the world. The mere possibility that consciousness is fundamental, that the universe is alive with awareness, that your inner life is a concentrated expression of cosmic mind, is enough to transform the texture of daily experience. It is enough to make you pause before a sunset and wonder whether the beauty you perceive exists only in your brain, or whether beauty is woven into the structure of things. It is enough to make you treat even the smallest creature with a little more gentleness on the chance that something within it knows what it is to exist. It is enough to make you lie down at the end of a long day and feel not the cold anxiety of an isolated mind in an indifferent universe, but the warm belonging of a being resting within a reality that is, in some ultimate and mysterious sense, aware of you. The rhythm of your breathing now is slower than it was when we began. The thoughts that raced through your mind have slowed to a gentle drift. The world outside your window continues its eternal turning. And somewhere in the vast dark between stars, light that left its source millions of years ago is still traveling, still carrying the information of ancient suns, still weaving the great web of connection that binds all things. You are part of that web. You have always been part of it. And in a few moments you will let consciousness shift once more, from the waking exploration of ideas to the dreaming exploration of images and feelings that await on the other side of sleep. Rest now within that presence. Let the rhythm of your breathing join the rhythm of the turning earth, and let the gentle mystery of consciousness, your consciousness, the universe's consciousness, carry you safely into the deep and dreamful dark. Sweet dreams, fellow travelers. The cosmos holds you close.